Hey guys, tonight we're going way, way back. Like farther back than kings with gout or queens with a suspicious number of cousins in their bloodline. We're going 3.2 million years into the past. So, if you're lying in bed, maybe under a warm blanket, just know you're about to meet some of the earliest awkward relatives of humanity, and also one of the most ridiculous animals evolution ever produced, a giant saber-tusked boar. Yes, you heard that right. Imagine a pig, but with tusks so oversized they look like some teenager tried to mod them in a video game and forgot to balance the stats. These things were not your average bacon factory. They were prehistoric tanks with teeth, and they definitely weren't cuddly. Now, before we meet our tusked friend, let's ease into the vibe. Picture Africa, 3.2 million years ago. No neon lights, no late-night YouTube binges, not even royalty to inbreed yet. Just endless savanna, early forests, and our first main characters, Homo habilis. They're not exactly human the way you and I are, but they're definitely trying their best. Think of them as that one cousin who insists they're a musician, but really just owns a guitar. Early attempts, rough drafts of humanity. Homo habilis is often called the handyman, not because they were great at fixing leaky faucets, but because they were the first hominins who started making stone tools. And when I say tools, don't get too excited, we're talking sharp rocks. If you expected hammers or IKEA sets, sorry. It was basically rock, but slightly more stabby. Still, baby steps. So there they are, trying to figure out how not to die in an ecosystem where everything bigger than you either wants to eat you or trample you, which is a fantastic setup for tonight's bedtime story. Because into this anxious little world stomps the saber-tusked boar. The saber-tusked boar. Let's talk about this creature. Its actual name is Metrodioporus, or sometimes Colpocorus, depending on which paleontologist you ask. But since no one is falling asleep to Latin at 2 a.m., let's just stick with giant saber-tusked boar. It's basically the prehistoric boss-level pig. Now, these pigs weren't like the ones you might see in a farmyard, lazily rolling in the mud. No, these were leaner, meaner, and apparently obsessed with dental overcompensation. Their tusks were huge, curling out like some kind of poorly thought-out fashion statement. Evolution basically said, what if we made pigs terrifying? And the result was this guy. To early humans, running into one of these beasts must have been, well, a bad day. Imagine you and your tiny Homo habilis friends are sitting around, happily chipping at rocks, when suddenly, here comes a pig the size of a small car, waving tusks around like medieval lances. The smart move? Run. The actual move? Probably also run, but with a lot of screaming. And this is where the comedy of prehistory begins, because Homo habilis, for all their handy branding, were not exactly apex predators. They weren't chasing boars down for dinner, more like waiting for the boar to die of natural causes and then nervously poking it to see if it was safe to snack on. The awkward beginnings of humanity. Let's pause here for a moment. Picture Homo habilis. About 4 feet tall, long arms, not a lot of social grace. They had brains bigger than chimps but smaller than us, so they were in this awkward teenage phase of evolution. Smart enough to figure out tools, dumb enough to think standing near a giant pig with tusks was a good idea. They likely lived in little groups, scavenging what they could, fruits, roots, leftover scraps from lions that were too lazy to finish their meal. Basically, the prehistoric freeloaders. And every so often they'd encounter the saber-tusked boar, which must have felt like meeting a nightmare straight out of a pig-themed horror movie. Now, were these boars actively hunting Homo habilis? No. They were mostly grazers, but that doesn't mean you'd want to share a watering hole with one. These animals had the kind of "don't mess with me" energy that even lions probably respected. And Homo habilis? They were definitely not brave enough to test that theory. But here's where it gets kind of funny. Scientists believe early humans may have followed these boars not to hunt them, but to grab whatever plants or fruits they dug up while rooting around. Imagine that. You're the future species that will one day invent TikTok, nuclear bombs, and scented candles, and your great-great-grand-ancestors are sneaking behind a pig, hoping it unearths some edible roots. Humble beginnings. Boar drama on the savannah. Of course, life wasn't all roots and pig watching. These saber-tusked boars were also competing with early humans for food. Picture it like this. Homo habilis finds a patch of tubers and is very proud of their discovery. Suddenly, in waddles this massive pig with tusks like a jousting knight, and boom, food gone. What are you going to do? Fight it? With your rock? No, you're going to step back politely and hope it doesn't notice you look like a snack. And this dynamic probably repeated itself countless times. Day after day, early humans trying to carve out an existence while giant pigs, saber-toothed cats, and elephants the size of buses kept stealing the spotlight. If you're starting to feel bad for Homo habilis, don't. They'll eventually evolve into Homo erectus, then into us. But right now, they're just background characters in the boar world. The irony, of course, is that the saber-tusked boar didn't make it. Evolution eventually said, "No thanks," and they went extinct. Meanwhile, Homo habilis and their descendants just kept stumbling forward, inventing fire, language, taxes, and eventually YouTube channels. So who's laughing now? Let's float over to another scene. Picture a watering hole. Herds of antelope, maybe a lurking crocodile, and off to the side a small group of Homo habilis nervously sipping water, while across from them a giant boar is casually dipping its snout. No one makes eye contact, everyone pretends it's fine. The tension is real, but also completely one-sided, because the boar does not care. Homo habilis? Probably shaking in their primitive sandals, if they'd even invented sandals, which, spoiler alert, they had not. It's a weird thought, isn't it? For us, pigs are farm animals, bacon, ham, cute little piglets in children's books. For early humans, pigs were nightmare fuel, the kind of animal you hoped you didn't bump into while looking for berries. And that's where we'll leave it for tonight's opening chapter. Early humans trying to survive, giant pigs stealing the show, and the long, awkward road of evolution stretching ahead like a very uneven path made of rocks, roots, and questionable decisions. So we left off with Homo habilis nervously hanging out by watering holes, trying not to make eye contact with a boar that looked like it could kill you just by sneezing. Now let's wander into their actual daily life, which, to be honest, wasn't exactly glamorous. You wake up. You stretch your long, slightly gangly arms. Your back hurts because your bed was dirt. Congratulations, it's another morning as a Homo habilis. Breakfast? If you're lucky, some berries. If you're less lucky, maybe some roots. And if you're very unlucky, you're the breakfast. That's the kind of life we're talking about. But Homo habilis did have one thing going for them: rocks. Not exciting, I know, but rocks were the cutting-edge technology of their day. Literally. Imagine being in a group of 10, and one guy figures out you can smash 2 rocks together and make a sharp edge. He's suddenly the Elon Musk of the savannah. Sure, it's just a jagged stone, but compared to bare hands, revolutionary. And these tools weren't just for show. Homo habilis used them for everything: scraping meat off bones, cutting up plants, probably bashing open nuts. Did they ever use them against a saber-tusked boar? Let's be honest, probably not. A rock against a boar that weighs several hundred pounds is like bringing a butter knife to a tank battle. But hey, it was a start. The original freeloaders. Now, here's where things get funny. Homo habilis wasn't exactly out there bringing down mammoths. They weren't even taking down medium-sized antelope. They were scavengers. Picture lions making a big kill, eating their fill and leaving scraps behind. That's when Homo habilis strolls in with their little sharp rocks, like, oh cool, leftovers. In other words, they were the prehistoric equivalent of someone who always shows up right after the pizza's been ordered. They didn't do the work, but they'll happily nibble on the crusts. And honestly, it worked. Scavenging let them get protein, and protein grew brains, which meant that, ironically, being freeloaders is one of the reasons we're even here today. But scavenging comes with a problem. Sometimes the animal that made the kill isn't done eating yet. Imagine creeping toward a half-eaten zebra, only to realize the lion is still there, glaring at you like, "Excuse me?" And Homo habilis wasn't built for fights. They didn't have speed, claws, or even a proper intimidation roar. Their main strategy? Look small, back away slowly, hope the lion forgets you exist. And while all of this was happening, the saber-tusked boar was still out there digging up roots and trampling over any patch of land Homo habilis thought might be a snack, because why not double down on being annoying? The social life of early humans. Let's float over to something softer. Social life. What was it like living in a Homo habilis group? Well, it wasn't exactly Downton Abbey. More like an extended family barbecue that never ends, but everyone smells bad and occasionally gets eaten. Groups were probably 10 to 20 individuals. They moved together, ate together, and huddled for warmth at night. Romance? Probably not candlelit. Let's just say reproduction was functional, not poetic. But being in a group had perks. More eyes to watch for predators, more hands to grab food, and, if you believe some scientists, maybe even the beginnings of language. Not Shakespeare-level sonnets, more like grunts and gestures. Still, imagine the pride of being the first Homo habilis to invent pointing. That's progress. And of course, group life meant drama. Who gets the best sleeping spot under the tree? Who hogs the sharpest rock? Who always wanders too close to the boar and nearly gets everyone trampled? If you think human pettiness started with medieval courts, think again. It's been around since the dirt floor days. Boar versus Homo habilis. Round 2. Let's circle back to our tusked menace, because inevitably Homo habilis and the giant boar crossed paths again. And while the boar wasn't exactly hunting humans, accidents happened. Picture this. Homo habilis is happily digging for roots. The boar is also digging for roots. Suddenly, eye contact. One of them is armed with tusks the size of scythes. The other has a slightly pointy rock. Do we even need to ask how this story ends? Most encounters probably ended with Homo habilis sprinting into the nearest bush, heart pounding, dignity shattered. Occasionally, maybe, the boar wandered off first, leaving the humans with a free patch of food. Either way, the boar won by default. It's the classic prehistoric power dynamic, large scary animal versus small nervous primate. Spoiler, small nervous primate will eventually invent Wi-Fi, but for now, it's not looking good. Survival wasn't pretty. And yet, somehow, they kept going. Day after day, year after year, Homo habilis survived. They weren't strong, they weren't fast, they weren't even particularly good hunters, but they were clever, they were stubborn, and most importantly, they didn't give up. That's the thing about evolution. It's not about being the strongest or the fiercest. It's about being just smart enough not to die. And Homo habilis excelled at that. They weren't kings, they weren't warriors, they were survivors. Which, let's be honest, is much less glamorous. But it worked. And as the centuries rolled on, those awkward little groups, huddled together for warmth, slowly learned more tricks, better tools, smarter scavenging, maybe even a tiny bit of fire use, though that's still debated. And all the while, the saber-tusked boar roamed the savanna, a living reminder that sometimes evolution just has fun with dental overkill. Let's drift off here. Picture it. The African plain, golden under the sun. A small group of Homo habilis, crouched together, picking at scraps with their little stone flakes. In the distance, the massive silhouette of a boar, tusks gleaming in the light. No one moves. Everyone waits. The moment passes. The balance holds. And life, awkward, fragile, stubborn life, goes on. So we've covered the basics. Homo habilis waking up on the dirt, scavenging leftovers, nervously watching pigs with tusks that looked like someone glued swords to their face. Now let's widen the picture a little, because believe it or not, the boar wasn't the only nightmare on the savannah. If you thought your neighborhood was sketchy, try living in East Africa 3.2 million years ago. It wasn't a gated community. It was basically the who's who of animals you really don't want to run into. Lions? Check. Leopards? Check. Giant hyenas the size of small bears? Check. And yes, everyone's favorite, saber-toothed cats. Because apparently regular cats weren't terrifying enough, so evolution slapped oversized daggers on their faces and called it a day. So where does Homo habilis fit in here? Short answer, the bottom. Long answer, the very, very bottom. They weren't apex predators. They weren't even mid-tier. If the food chain were a medieval feast, Homo habilis wasn't sitting at the table. They were hanging out by the trash pile, hoping to sneak some crumbs. Enter the saber-toothed cat. Let's float over to one of those encounters. Picture a Homo habilis happily scraping marrow out of a bone with his precious sharp rock. Suddenly, the grass rustles. Out steps a saber-toothed cat, two enormous fangs curving down like nature's very unsubtle flex, and Homo habilis, he's about 4 feet tall, wide-eyed, and already reconsidering every life decision that led him here. Now, the funny part, saber-toothed cats probably weren't as efficient hunters as modern lions. Those long fangs looked impressive, but they were fragile. You couldn't just go chomping down on a bone without risking a dental disaster. So they needed precision kills, usually by clamping down on the neck. But tell that to Homo habilis in the moment. He wasn't thinking, yes, the biomechanics of Smilodon. He was thinking, rock not helping, rock very useless, goodbye forever. And just like that, the humans scatter, which is basically the running theme of this period. Something scary shows up, Homo habilis scatters. The giant hyena, nobody asked for. Now, while saber-toothed cats get all the Hollywood attention, the giant hyenas deserve their own little bedtime cameo. Today's hyenas already have bad PR, awkward laughs, bone-crunching jaws, and a habit of stealing kills. But 3 million years ago, they were even bigger. Imagine a hyena bulked up like it's been hitting the Stone Age gym. Twice the size, twice the bite force, and 0 patience for scavengers. Which is unfortunate because scavenging was literally Homo habilis' brand. So you can imagine the awkwardness. Our ancestors creep up to a zebra carcass, sharpening their little rock flakes, and then here comes this monster hyena. At that point, the decision wasn't whether to fight. The decision was whether to run left or right. Spoiler, both directions were bad. So yes, the hyenas were bullies, the cats were terrifying, and the saber-tusked boar, well, he was still stomping around, reminding everyone that pigs could be horrifying too. Truly a golden age of nightmares. Climate chaos. And as if predators weren't enough, the climate couldn't make up its mind either. One century, lush forests. The next, dry savanna. It was like living with a landlord who kept redecorating without asking. For Homo habilis, this meant constant adaptation. When the trees were around, they could climb to escape danger. When the trees vanished, it was open grassland, and suddenly, running on two legs became a much better survival strategy. Evolution took notes. Brains got a little bigger. Bodies got a little more upright. All because the thermostat of the Earth couldn't decide whether it wanted to be tropical or desert chic. And through all of it, the boar endured. Saber-tusked, root-digging, tusk-swinging, generally rude. In some ways, the boar was more consistent than the weather, which is maybe why it loomed so large in the story of early humans. Not because they hunted it, but because it was always there. Group anxiety, prehistoric edition. Living in small groups meant Homo habilis had to watch out for one another, which sounds heartwarming, until you realize it mostly meant taking turns spotting predators. Imagine being the lookout. You're perched on a termite mound, scanning the horizon. If it's lions, you sound the alarm. If it's hyenas, you sound the alarm. If it's the saber-tusked boar, you also sound the alarm. Not because it's going to eat you, but because it's about to bulldoze through your precious berry patch. And here's where it gets a little ironic. All this stress, all this constant scanning for danger made Homo habilis smarter. Brains grew because life was basically one long anxiety attack. So the next time someone tells you anxiety is useless, just remember it's literally why you exist. Let's settle the scene before we drift off. The African dusk, the sky glowing red, a group of Homo habilis huddled together, nervously chewing whatever scraps they'd managed to find. Off in the distance, a hyena's laugh. Closer still, the low grunt of a giant boar. Everyone freezes. No one moves. And then, slowly the sounds fade into the night. Life continues. Fragile, awkward, but stubbornly persistent. So far, Homo habilis has been the underdog of underdogs. Scavengers, snack-sized for predators, constantly upstaged by a pig with tusks, long enough to double his coat racks. But slowly, painfully slowly, things started to shift. It all comes back to rocks. Yes, again with the rocks, because when your entire life is about survival, a slightly sharper edge on a piece of stone suddenly feels like splitting the atom. At first, it was just bashing two rocks together to get a jagged flake. Crude. Messy. Honestly, not much better than an accident. But over time, some of them figured out patterns. Certain angles worked better. Certain types of stone chipped more cleanly. And just like that, a new era of technology began. Were they making swords and spears? No, they were making improved can openers for zebra bones. But it was progress. Tiny progress. The kind of thing you wouldn't even notice in a museum unless someone put a sign under it. But for Homo habilis, it was the first real taste of invention. The accidental engineers. Now, here's the funny thing. Scientists believe tool-making wasn't necessarily planned at first. It might have started as sheer clumsiness. Someone's holding a rock, trips, smashes it, and bam, sharp edge. Suddenly, a new door opens, because nothing says innovation like falling on your face. But once they noticed how useful sharp edges were, Homo habilis leaned in. Tools became part of daily life, cutting, scraping, prying. And maybe, just maybe, the beginnings of hunting. Not with spears, but with patience, Think of a group of awkward little proto-humans with sharp rocks trying to gang up on something smaller than themselves. Not graceful, not efficient, but the seeds of strategy were there. Of course, if the target was anything remotely large, like a boar with tusks longer than your arm, the plan was simple. Don't. Survival wasn't about bravery. It was about knowing when your rock wasn't up to the job. Fire, or maybe not yet. This is where the debate gets interesting. Some researchers think Homo habilis might have had an early flirtation with fire. Not controlled, cozy campfires with marshmallows, more like opportunistic borrowing. Lightning strikes a tree, fire starts, and Homo habilis wanders in afterward to enjoy the warmth, or maybe grab half-cooked meat. Did they figure out how to make fire themselves? Probably not. That leap would come later, with Homo erectus. But even just sitting near a fire, feeling the heat must have been life-changing. A glimpse of something bigger, a foreshadowing of humanity's future obsession with flames, candles, stoves, fireworks, and eventually burning entire forests for fun. But back in 3.2 million years ago, fire was more like a rare treat, a temporary bonus, something you stumbled on, enjoyed for a night, and lost by morning. Now, let's float over to group behavior again, because survival wasn't a solo act. Homo habilis probably cooperated in simple ways, sharing food, warning each other about danger, maybe even surrounding small prey. But cooperation comes with drama. Who gets the first bite? Who hoards the sharpest rock? Who panics and runs every time the boar shows up? If you think office politics are bad, imagine 10 hungry proto-humans trying to divide one zebra leg. Grunting, shoving, glaring, no HR department, no rules, just raw prehistoric squabbles. And yet, this messy teamwork planted the seeds of something huge: language, storytelling, eventually, gossip. Because apparently, the ability to talk behind someone's back is one of evolution's greatest survival tools. And speaking of drama, let's not forget our tusked roommate. The saber-tusked boar didn't care about Homo habilis's shiny new rocks. It didn't care about their first baby steps toward teamwork. It cared about digging up roots, grazing, and occasionally trampling through human plans like a prehistoric bulldozer. Imagine this scene: a small group of Homo habilis carefully setting up around a carcass. They're proud. They've got tools. They're feeling clever. And then, here comes the boar, snorting, tusks gleaming, casually claiming the entire spot as his. The humans scatter, grumbling, clutching their rocks, already planning how they'll complain about this later. It's humbling, isn't it? Our ancestors, future masters of the planet, cowering in front of a pig. Not even a carnivore, just a very pushy herbivore with ridiculous teeth. But that's evolution for you. Sometimes the path to greatness starts with knowing when to back away from dinner. And through all of this, predators, climate swings, obnoxious pigs, Homo habilis kept inching forward. Brain size increased. Tools got better. Social groups became more complex. They weren't thriving yet, but they were surviving. That stubbornness is the quiet heartbeat of the story. Not brilliance, not strength, just persistence. The ability to wake up every morning on a dirt bed, dodge hyenas, lose food to pigs, and still keep going, because eventually persistence pays off. And while the saber-tusked boar would vanish from history, extinct, and forgotten by all but paleontologists, the descendants of Homo habilis would keep climbing the evolutionary ladder. Slowly, awkwardly, but inevitably. And picture it one last time tonight. A circle of Homo habilis huddled under the stars, clutching sharp rocks like prized treasures. A distant roar echoes in the dark. Closer still, the grunt of a boar. Everyone tenses, hearts pounding, but they stay. Just a little braver than yesterday. Just enough to last another day, and another, until eventually those days would add up to us. We've been hanging out with Homo habilis for a while now, watching them wake up on dirt, make rocks slightly pointier, and run away from pretty much everything with teeth. And you might be wondering, how long can this possibly go on? Well, the answer is a surprisingly long time. Homo habilis existed for almost 1 million years, which, in human attention span, is roughly the equivalent of sitting through one royal genealogy chart. In other words, it dragged on forever. But during that time, something important happened. Brains got a little bigger. Tools got a little sharper. Groups got a little more organized. And slowly, very slowly, Homo habilis started giving way to their slightly taller, slightly smarter cousins, Homo erectus. Now, before we get carried away, let's be clear. Homo erectus wasn't showing up in tuxedos with fire pits and fine dining. They were just a bit better at not dying, a little more upright, a little more coordinated, a little less terrified of everything that moved, which in prehistoric standards was basically a glow-up. Evolution, the slowest self-improvement plan. If you're imagining evolution as some grand, dramatic transformation, don't. It wasn't like one day Homo habilis woke up and said, "Surprise, I'm Homo erectus now." It was more like a painfully slow software update, with millions of tiny glitches along the way. Think of it this way. You've got a group of Homo habilis who are slightly taller than average. They survive a little better. Their kids inherit that height. Then maybe some of those kids also have slightly better brains. Fast forward a few 100,000 years, and you've got a new species. Which, let's be honest, is just nature's way of saying, "Congrats, you didn't die. Here's an upgrade." And through all of this, the saber-tusked boar kept on roaming. Because while humans were busy stumbling through their beta versions, pigs were staying pigs, only scarier. Boar versus humanity, round infinity. Let's float back to our tusked menace. Even as Homo habilis started making better tools, the boar remained a problem. You can sharpen rocks all you want. It still doesn't change the fact that you're 4 feet tall and the boar looks like a prehistoric tank with a very bad attitude. So the relationship stayed the same. Humans scavenged scraps, boars bulldozed through food patches, and everyone just awkwardly coexisted. If anything, the boar became a kind of evolutionary training partner, a reminder that being clever was the only real way forward, because brute strength wasn't happening. It's almost poetic. The boar wasn't trying to shape human evolution, but by being so obnoxiously unmanageable, it forced our ancestors to get smarter, to cooperate better, to wait for better tools. In a weird way, the pig pushed us along, which is not a sentence I thought I'd ever say out loud. Social experiments, the messy kind. Meanwhile, life in Homo habilis groups continued. The beginnings of social order, who got food first, who got the best sleeping spots, were slowly forming, which naturally meant conflict. Even proto-humans couldn't resist a little drama. Did they have leaders? Maybe. Or maybe leadership was just whoever managed to grab food without dropping it. Did they share evenly? Almost certainly not. Sharing isn't exactly a default setting. It's more of a learned trick. So it was probably messy. Arguments over scraps, grudges over rocks, the whole prehistoric soap opera. But within that mess was progress, cooperation, competition, even the faint spark of culture. Maybe gestures, maybe shared sounds, maybe, if you squint really hard, the beginnings of storytelling. And what better bedtime story than the one about the giant pig that ruined everyone's dinner? A world in transition. As the millennia passed, Africa itself was changing. Forests shrinking, grasslands spreading. This constant shifting landscape forced Homo habilis to move, to adapt, to get creative. Some stayed behind, others wandered, and with every move, a little more of the human spark grew. But no matter where they went, the cast of characters was the same. Lions, hyenas, saber-toothed cats, and of course, the boar. Always the boar. If evolution were a play, the pig would be the stubborn side character who refuses to exit the stage. The inevitable goodbye. Eventually, though, time caught up. Homo habilis, for all their stubbornness, couldn't last forever. Their descendants, better equipped and better brained, took over the stage. The species faded out. Quietly. No dramatic extinction event, just slipping into history. And the boar? Well, eventually it too disappeared. Extinct. Tusks gone. Name forgotten by everyone except paleontologists with too much coffee. But the memory of it, the impact of surviving in its shadow, lived on in the DNA of the humans who came next. So, if you ever feel unimpressive, just remember, your ancestors once spent their lives running away from a pig, and somehow that was enough to get us here. Picture it now, dusk on the savannah, a group of Homo habilis, worn and weary, huddled around the fading warmth of a stolen fire. Off in the distance, a boar grunts, claiming the land is its own. Everyone listens, no one moves. And then, slowly, they close their eyes. Tomorrow, it begins again. One more day, one more chance, one more step toward the long future waiting in the dark. So far, we've been picturing Homo habilis as these small, scrappy creatures with rocks in their hands and terror in their eyes, which is accurate. But let's slow down and actually take a good look at them, because honestly, they were odd. Imagine someone standing up in the middle of a family reunion and announcing, "I'm the missing link." That's Homo habilis, not fully ape, not fully human, just hanging out in the weird middle ground. First impressions. Homo habilis stood about 4 feet tall, maybe a bit more if they stretched. Their arms were long, longer than ours, like nature hadn't quite decided if they should stay in the trees or commit to walking on the ground. And their legs, short and stubby, which meant walking looked less like a confident human stride and more like a wobbly toddler determined not to fall over. Their heads were small, but their faces were big. Wide noses, strong jaws, thick brow ridges, and brains that, while larger than their ape relatives, were still on the modest side, about half the size of ours. Think of it like running modern software on very limited storage. Things worked, but slowly. If you saw one today, you probably wouldn't think, "Oh, hey, cousin." You'd probably think, "Why is that oddly proportioned ape holding a rock like it knows what it's doing?" The teeth situation. Because teeth are a big deal in paleoanthropology. Homo habilis had smaller teeth than their earlier relatives, which suggests they weren't just gnawing on raw plants all day. They were cutting, slicing, maybe even softening food. But smaller didn't mean perfect. Dental problems probably existed. Cracks, breaks, infections. Imagine having a toothache without dentists, without painkillers, without even the ability to complain properly. That was daily life. And honestly, it's impressive they survived it all. the hands that named them. The name habilis literally means handyman, which sounds flattering, but in reality it just means they could manage not to drop rocks too often. Their hands were actually fascinating, halfway between ape and human. Long, curved fingers, good for climbing, but also surprisingly capable of gripping tools. They couldn't carve a masterpiece, but they could chip away at stone until it was sharp enough to cut, which in the prehistoric world was the equivalent of a technological revolution. Still, it's worth remembering tools at this point weren't glamorous. No polished axes or shiny spears, just rocks with slightly better edges. If you handed one to a modern 5-year-old, they'd probably throw it back at you. But for Homo habilis, these rocks were survival itself. Walking, a constant struggle. Homo habilis could walk upright, but upright is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Their short legs and long arms made their gait awkward. Less of a confident stroll, more like a shuffle. Add in uneven terrain, predators lurking everywhere, and you've got the prehistoric version of a clumsy commute. Running was even worse. With legs that short, speed wasn't an option, which meant their main defensive strategy was don't get noticed. And if you did get noticed, hope you could climb fast enough, or more likely just accept your role as lunch. Daily survival the slow way. Picture a typical day. Wake up in the dirt, scratch yourself, wander around looking for food. If you're lucky, you find fruit. If you're less lucky, you find a half-rotten carcass and spend 20 minutes trying to scrape meat off a rock. Sometimes you hunt small animals. Sometimes you steal leftovers from bigger predators who wandered off. And sometimes you just don't eat. Starvation was a constant threat. But through all this, they survived. Not comfortably, not heroically, just stubbornly. Which, let's be honest, is the only reason we're here today. Social life. Not quite there yet. Living in small groups meant there was at least some sense of us versus the world, but social life was bare bones. Grooming, sharing food, maybe some early communication. No fireside chats, no campfire songs, just a lot of sitting around in mutual silence, hoping the boar didn't show up again. Did they care about each other? Probably. Evidence suggests they may have supported weaker members, maybe even looked after injured individuals, which is touching, until you remember their version of care was probably just not immediately abandoning someone. Still, baby steps. The fashion report. Spoiler, there wasn't any. No clothes, no ornaments, no accessories, just bare skin and hair. Protection from the elements came down to find shade or sit in the sun. Rain? You got wet. Cold? You shivered. Style? Not invented yet. And yet, this was the groundwork, the raw material. From here, in a few million years, we'd have crowns, wigs, corsets, powdered faces, and entire dynasties of royals making terrible fashion decisions. But it all started with a naked little group of Homo habilis shuffling awkwardly across the savannah. The long view. Looking back, Homo habilis feels almost comical. Short, awkward, not particularly glamorous. But that's the point. They weren't here to impress. They were here to survive, to hold on to life long enough to pass the baton. And somehow they managed it. Through bad teeth, awkward walks, endless hunger, and the constant looming presence of a pig that could kill them in one charge. It's not heroic, it's not glamorous, but it's exactly the kind of persistence that makes history possible. Imagine it, a group of them settling down for the night. The grass rustles, the air cools, they curl up close. No fire, no tools, just bodies pressed together for warmth. Above, the stars. Around them, the noises of predators. And somewhere out there, the boar. Always the boar. And yet, they sleep because tomorrow will come, awkward legs and all. So by now, we know Homo habilis wasn't exactly built for greatness. Short legs, bad teeth, rocks for tools, not a lot going for them. But somehow, they managed to make it through centuries of hunger. How? By becoming professional scavengers. That's right, our ancestors weren't brave hunters, chasing down game like action heroes. They were more like opportunistic freeloaders, hanging out at the edges of someone else's kill, waiting for the right moment to sneak in. The waiting game. Picture this. A pride of lions brings down an antelope. Everyone's eating, growling, snarling, looking dangerous. And a few meters away, there's a little group of Homo habilis pretending to be casual, just hanging around, trying not to look obvious, but secretly waiting for scraps. When the lions get full and wander off, habilis shuffles in. They grab bones, not leftovers, maybe chip away at marrow with their precious rocks. It's not glamorous, it's not heroic, but it's calories, and calories are life. Of course, the risk was obvious. Sometimes lions weren't quite done. Sometimes hyenas showed up first. Sometimes the boar appeared, deciding it owned the whole carcass. And in those cases, habilis had to scatter, empty-handed, back to square one. But when it worked, and it worked just enough to keep them alive. The bone crackers. One of the biggest breakthroughs of Homo habilis wasn't just scavenging, but what they did after scavenging. They figured out that bones, those leftover scraps predators ignored, could still hold treasures. With sharp rocks, they cracked open bones to reach marrow, fat-rich, nutrient-dense marrow, something no lion cared about, but habilis adored. And honestly, it was genius. They weren't competing head-on with apex predators. They were exploiting loopholes. It's like showing up at a buffet after the main rush and realizing the dessert table is untouched. Everyone else is gone, but you're still eating. Opportunists, not hunters. Were they hunters? Sort of. Small animals, maybe. Lizards, rodents, birds if they got really lucky. But big game? Not a chance. Chasing a zebra across the savannah with short legs and bad stamina would have ended in disaster. So they didn't bother. They let others do the heavy lifting, then moved in for the leftovers. Not heroic, not bold, but very practical. It also meant they weren't picky. Fruit, tubers, nuts, insects, rotting meat, it was all on the table. Basically, if it could be chewed, it was food. And sometimes, even if it couldn't really be chewed, they gave it a shot anyway. Annoying the neighborhood. Now let's be honest, no predator liked having a group of awkward proto-humans lurking around their kills. Lions hated it. Hyenas hated it. Probably even vultures rolled their eyes. But habilis kept doing it anyway. It must have been frustrating for predators. You go through all the effort of a kill only to turn around and see a group of weird little bipeds tiptoeing closer, holding rocks like they're gonna do something. And yet habilis never stopped. Persistence was their superpower. Annoy everyone long enough and eventually you get fed. The pig problem, again. And of course, lurking in the background was the boar. Unlike lions who eventually got full, or hyenas who might wander off, the saber-tusked boar didn't share. Ever. If it showed up at a carcass, that was the end of the party. It didn't matter if habilis had been waiting all afternoon. One grunt from the boar, and they were out of there. Survival instinct kicked in fast, because while scavenging was clever, getting gored by tusks the size of knives wasn't worth it. So scavenging culture came with a constant caveat. Always check if the pig's around. The slow rise of cleverness. But here's where it gets interesting. Scavenging wasn't just a survival strategy, it was also an intelligence workout. To scavenge successfully, Habilis had to watch, wait, and time things carefully. They had to recognize predator behavior, know when danger was passing, and seize the moment. It wasn't brute strength, it was patience, awareness, a little strategy. And that in turn shaped their minds. Scavenging demanded problem solving, which nudged their brains just a little closer to what we'd call human. And the first whisper of culture. And maybe, just maybe, these habits started to ripple out socially. Maybe someone in the group was better at spotting when it was safe. Maybe someone else was good at cracking bones. Slowly, roles began to form. Informal, fragile, but real. It wasn't culture as we know it, but it was the seed of it. Cooperation, skill sharing, maybe even the earliest sense of, you do this, I'll do that. And it all started with scraps. The reality of prehistoric dinner. So yes, when you imagine the first humans, don't picture bold hunters taking down mammoths with spears. Picture small, awkward bipeds waiting for lions to leave, rushing in, gnawing on bones, and then nervously glancing over their shoulders for boars. That was dinner. Every night. For generations. And while it sounds pitiful now, it worked. It worked so well that Habilis survived long enough to pass on their genes, long enough to eventually give rise to us, long enough to make this entire sleepy history ramble possible. So tonight, when you're settling down to eat your snack, just remember your ancestors would have been thrilled to have what's in your fridge, and they would have definitely tried to steal it from you. So let's take a break from all the scavenging and running away from pigs and ask a simple question. What did Homo habilis say to each other? The short answer, probably nothing we'd recognize. The long answer, a messy mix of grunts, gestures, and facial expressions that somehow managed to keep everyone alive. A world without words. Language as we know it didn't exist yet. No words, no grammar, no bedtime stories. Just sounds. Maybe a warning grunt for lion, maybe a gesture for food, maybe a whine for I want that. If you think human communication is chaotic today, imagine living in a group where everything had to be expressed by waving your arms and making noises. Misunderstandings were probably constant. Someone points at a tree and grunts, half the group thinks it means fruit, the other half thinks it means leopard. Chaos ensues. And yet, it worked well enough. The face as a tool. One thing habilis had going for them. Expressive faces. Eyebrows, lips, posture. These became their survival toolkit. A raised brow could mean danger. A bared tooth could mean aggression. A soft expression could mean, don't steal my food, please. It wasn't Shakespeare, but it was something. And honestly, given that most modern text conversations still rely on emojis to make sense, maybe not much has changed. The gossip that wasn't. Now, humans today thrive on gossip. Entire royal dynasties were fueled by it. But habilis? They didn't have the luxury. They couldn't sit around whispering about who stole whose marrow bone. At best, they could gesture angrily, maybe shove someone, maybe sulk in a corner. Social tension existed, but without words, it simmered quietly, which might have actually been a blessing. Imagine the drama if they could actually articulate their grudges. Parenting the prehistoric way. Communication was especially vital with children, and Homo habilis, like us, had long childhoods compared to other animals. Kids took years to become independent, which meant a lot of gestures, grunts, and pointing were probably devoted to keeping toddlers alive. Picture it. A little habilis child toddling toward a predator, parents waving their arms frantically and making noises that roughly translate to, "No, don't do that." Some things never change. The seeds of something bigger. But here's the fascinating part. These little gestures and sounds may not have been language, but they were stepping stones. They required memory. They required some shared understanding. They required attention to social cues. Over time, that nudged brains toward more complexity. It laid the groundwork for the future explosion of language. So while habilis never gave speeches, they planted the seeds. And without those seeds, we wouldn't have poetry, bedtime podcasts, or sarcastic history monologues about saber-tusked pigs. Sleepy social life. Evenings in a habilis group were probably quiet affairs. No chatter, no storytelling, just the hum of insects, the occasional grunt, and the subtle comfort of being together. Communication wasn't flashy, but it was enough to bind them. Think of it like the world's first awkward dinner party. Everyone chewing, no one talking, yet somehow everyone knew what was going on. The Boar test. And of course, communication had its ultimate trial, the Boar. Imagine the group sees it approaching. Someone grunts, someone else waves their arms, everyone scrambles. If they got it wrong, if the warning wasn't clear, that was the end of the story. So clarity mattered, which meant those little grunts and gestures weren't just survival add-ons, they were survival itself. From grunts to gossip. So no, habilis didn't chat, but they started something much bigger. They began the long, winding journey from random noises to structured speech. And in that messy in-between, they taught us one of history's biggest lessons. Communication doesn't have to be perfect to work. Sometimes a grunt, a glance, and a wave of the arm is enough to say, "Danger! Pig incoming!" Imagine it now. Dusk falling, a group huddled in the grass, silent except for the occasional cough or grunt. Someone gestures toward a tree, the others nod. No words are spoken, but the meaning is clear. The night begins. They sleep together, secure in their unspoken understanding. And in that silence, the very first whispers of language are waiting. So far, we've covered scavenging, grunting, awkward walking, and the eternal pig problem. But humans, yes, even proto-humans, are never just about survival. There's always a layer of social messiness lurking in the background. Homo habilis wasn't just scraping marrow bones. They were learning, very slowly, how to live together, which meant emotions, grudges, rivalries, and yes, prehistoric drama. The group comes first, sort of. Living alone wasn't really an option. The savanna was too dangerous, the predators too relentless. Safety came in numbers, which meant Homo habilis had to tolerate each other. But tolerance isn't the same as harmony. Groups meant sharing food, finding sleeping spots, and negotiating space. And when food is scarce, negotiations tend to get loud. Well, grunt loud. Someone always got less, someone always sulked, and someone always shoved. It wasn't full-blown politics, but it was the start of it. The alpha question. Did Homo habilis have leaders? Probably, but not in the crown and scepter sense. More like the individual who was physically stronger or better at spotting danger or simply had the nerve to grab food first and not let go. Leadership may have been situational. One day, the best climber was in charge. Another day, the sharpest-eyed lookout got respect. No coronations, no ceremonies, just whoever seemed useful in the moment. It's a far cry from medieval monarchs who held on to power for life even when they were drooling into a goblet, but the principle was the same. Someone was always at the top of the heap, however small the heap was. And of course, conflict was inevitable. Food fights weren't metaphorical, they were literal. Someone grabbed an extra chunk, someone else growled, and suddenly the whole group was rolling in the dirt. Did they hold grudges? Probably. Apes do. Modern humans definitely do. So chances are Habilis had their own long simmering feuds. He stole my marrow bone last week. I'm not sharing today. That sort of thing. Tiny, petty conflicts, but out of them came the beginnings of order. Because even grudges require memory, and memory is the first step towards social rules. Affection, in its own way. Of course, it wasn't all drama. Living in groups also meant bonds. Maybe grooming each other. Maybe huddling close at night for warmth. Maybe carrying infants together. Affection wasn't sentimental, it wasn't romantic, but it was survival. And out of that necessity came the first faint glimmers of what we'd later call love, loyalty, and friendship. So yes, even 3.2 million years ago, someone was probably side-eyeing someone else's kid and thinking, fine, I'll babysit, but only because we'll all die if I don't. Hierarchy in the dirt. Over time, these little patterns, who got food first, who got protection, who had allies, formed into something resembling hierarchy. Not official, not stable, but real enough. The strongest individuals held sway. The clever ones found niches. The weaker ones relied on cooperation to survive. And out of that mess, a proto-society took shape. It was fragile, always shifting, but it was there. And it set the stage for everything that came later: chieftains, kings, emperors, and endless royal egos collapsing under the weight of power. Emotional range, bigger than we think. Now, did Homo habilis experience emotions the way we do? Maybe not in full complexity, but fear, anger, curiosity, jealousy, those were there. Think of it like the beta version of the modern emotional package. No poetry about longing, no existential dread, just the basics. Enough to cause problems, but not enough to write sad medieval ballads about it. Still, those basics were powerful. They shaped behavior. They shaped relationships. They made survival more than just finding food. They made it about navigating each other. And, of course, nothing tested social order quite like the boar. Picture it. The group is squabbling over scraps, glaring and grunting. Then the boar shows up. Instantly, all conflicts dissolve. Everyone scatters in the same direction. Survival trumped grudges every time. In that sense, the boar was more than just a predator. It was a social reset button, a reminder that hierarchy, emotions, and grudges only mattered until a tusked tank came charging through the grass. Seeds of future chaos. So what do we see here? Not politics, not kingdoms, but the roots of them. The messy beginning of social order, the fragile first attempts at hierarchy, the sparks of emotional depth. From there, it's only a short evolutionary leap, well, a couple million years, before humans are sitting on thrones, staging coups, and writing tragic love letters. But it all began with a group of Homo habilis sitting in the dirt, trying not to fight too much before bedtime. Imagine it now, twilight on the savannah, a group huddled together, stomachs half full, eyes half shut. They've bickered, they've shoved, they've sulked. But now, in the cool night air, the conflicts fade. They settle in. The boar is out there somewhere, but for now, there is peace. Tomorrow, the drama begins again. By now, Homo habilis has been wandering, scavenging, grunting, and occasionally running from tusked pigs for hundreds of generations. But the world around them wasn't standing still. Africa 3.2 million years ago was a place of constant flux. Forests shrinking, grasslands expanding, rivers drying, lakes filling, and rain patterns swinging wildly. Imagine trying to build a life when your home keeps rearranging itself. That's exactly what habilis faced. Forests to grasslands. Some centuries, they woke up surrounded by lush forests, canopy overhead, dappled sunlight, and trees to climb. Safe, shaded, full of fruit and insects. Perfect. Other centuries, forests receded. Open savannas stretched endlessly. Grasses swaying in winds that brought no shade and every predator into view. Suddenly, the ground they thought they knew became a gauntlet of danger. Homo habilis had to adapt, or die. Short legs, long arms, awkward walks, these weren't exactly optimal for sprinting across open plains. But necessity forced tiny innovations. Group vigilance, stealth, tool use. Survival demanded creativity. Water woes. Rivers, lakes, and streams weren't constant either. Sometimes water was plentiful, sometimes scarce. Habilis had to keep track of watering holes, learn which spots dried up seasonally, and share knowledge. One miscalculation could be fatal. Wander too far from water during a dry season, and death awaited. Stay too close to predators at a water hole, and death awaited. It was a delicate balance. And yet, somehow, they managed. Not always elegantly, not always successfully, but just often enough. Food uncertainty. With climate shifts came food uncertainty. Fruit trees would vanish, tubers would dry up, large prey might migrate. And every time this happened, the scavenger strategy had to adjust. Small mammals, insects, and even roots became vital survival resources. Flexibility was everything. A failure to innovate, even a temporary lapse, could mean hunger, weakness, or death. Through it all, the boar remained consistent. Tusks as intimidating as ever, digging, grazing, occasionally ruining a meal. Some constancies are comforting, others are terrifying. Coping mechanisms. How did Homo habilis cope? By being small, observant, and persistent. Awareness of surroundings became crucial. The ability to improvise with rocks, to watch predators, to move quietly, to cooperate in a crisis. These skills weren't just useful, they were mandatory. The changing environment acted like a relentless teacher. Mistakes were punished quickly. Successes were fleeting but taught lessons. And through this cycle, the foundations of human adaptability were quietly forming. Mental maps. Over time, Homo habilis began developing mental maps of their territory. They remembered where water was, where predators often roamed, which areas provided food at different times of year. This wasn't conscious cartography, of course. No drawings in the dirt, no GPS. But memory, observation, and experience combined into a kind of spatial intelligence, a skill critical to survival and a precursor to the wandering, problem-solving humans of the future. Weather and fire. And speaking of environmental challenges, imagine sudden storms, unseasonal rains, or scorching heat. Without shelter, humans had to endure. Fire would come later, but for now they relied on natural features, caves, dense thickets, termite mounds for shade. Each environmental pressure nudged them toward innovation, indirectly shaping the cognitive leaps that would come. A delicate balance. All these factors, climate swings, predator pressures, food scarcity, formed a delicate balance. Survive one season, and you might make it to the next. Fail, and extinction lurked. It was humbling, persistent, and unglamorous, perfect for sleep-inducing history. No heroics, no epic battles, just quiet, constant adaptation. Nightfall on a shifting world. Picture it now, the sun dips below the horizon. A small group of Homo habilis settles near a fading puddle, sharing warmth, occasionally glancing at the distance for danger. The air is cooler, the ground softer from recent rains. Somewhere, a boar snorts in the dark, reminding everyone that life is never predictable. They survive, they endure, they adapt. And slowly, inexorably, the patterns of survival etch themselves into the species that will one day become fully human. So, here we are. After millions of years of awkward walking, grunting, scavenging, bone cracking, and occasionally being scared out of their minds by a boar, Homo habilis comes to the end of their story. Not with fireworks, not with a heroic charge, not even with a dramatic extinction. Just quietly, gradually, they give way to the next generation, Homo erectus, smarter, taller, and slightly more competent. Survival, not glory. That's the remarkable thing about habilis. They weren't built for glory. They weren't elegant, strong, or majestic. They weren't inventors or kings. They were persistent. Day after day, season after season, they endured. They faced hunger, heat, storms, predators, and pigs. They failed often, they survived just enough. And in that persistence, they left a legacy. Not in monuments or written records, but in something much more enduring. The very blueprint of what it means to be human. Tools, social bonds, and brains. Look back at their accomplishments. Simple tools, crude but effective. Cooperation in groups, communication in gestures and grunts, observation, patience, memory. These aren't flashy victories, but they're foundational. They are the tiny nudges in the evolutionary story that make everything else possible. From these awkward beginnings would come the first controlled fires, the first hunting strategies, the first real language, and eventually, civilization itself. All because a species kept putting one foot in front of the other, day after day, awkwardly, imperfectly, but stubbornly. The ever-present boar. And we can't forget the boar, that grunting, tusked reminder that life is unpredictable. Through millions of years, the boar remained a constant challenge. It tested patience, taught caution, reinforced cooperation, and sometimes simply reminded habilis that survival required humility. Perhaps in the grand story of evolution, the boar was an unacknowledged mentor. Harsh, pushy, and deadly, yes, but instructive. Reflections on a small, scrappy species. Homo habilis was small, awkward, and not particularly impressive, but they were the quiet builders of a future we now take for granted. They show us that greatness doesn't always roar. Sometimes it shuffles, sometimes it grunts, sometimes it scrapes marrow from a bone and hopes for the best. And in that quiet, persistent way, they set the stage for everything that followed. Larger brains, longer limbs, controlled fire, complex social hierarchies, and eventually, humans who could sit comfortably at night listening to long, sleep-inducing history monologues about them. A gentle end. So tonight, as you imagine the savannah, Imagine a small group of Homo habilis settling down. The stars spread above them, the air cooling, the distant snort of a boar somewhere far off. They huddle together, as they have for generations, tired, hungry, cautious, and still stubbornly alive. They close their eyes, not knowing what tomorrow will bring, only that it must be faced. And in that quiet, humble act, they pass on more than genes. They pass on survival, adaptation, and the faint, flickering beginnings of humanity itself. So when you drift off to sleep, you can picture it. Small, awkward, clever little creatures on the savannah. Not heroic, not glamorous, just persistent. And somehow, that was enough. The story of Homo habilis ends quietly, but their echo lives on. In us. Even though Homo habilis vanished millions of years ago, their story doesn't truly end. Every human who has ever walked the earth carries whispers of their persistence, curiosity, and awkward ingenuity. It's easy to look at them and see only small, clumsy creatures struggling for survival. But in doing so, we overlook something extraordinary. They laid the foundations of everything that followed. The human spark. Think of it this way. Homo habilis was the spark in the dark. Not fire, not polished tools, not clever inventions, just spark. A tiny flicker of problem-solving, social connection, and survival instinct. That spark traveled across generations, evolving into Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, and eventually us. Every time we cooperate, communicate, innovate, or endure hardship, there's a shadow of habilis behind it. A quiet, persistent ancestor reminding us that even small, imperfect steps matter. Lessons from the savannah. From their daily struggles, we can learn a few things. Persistence matters. They survived not by being the fastest or the strongest, but by refusing to give up. Observation is powerful. Paying attention to predators, weather, and each other kept them alive. And cooperation is key. Even minimal social bonds allowed them to survive challenges they couldn't face alone. And yes, maybe also, watch out for the metaphorical bores in life. Some challenges will always be there, grunting, tusked, and insistent, but they shape who we become. A gentle goodbye. So tonight, as we let this story fade, imagine the savannah stretching endlessly. A group of small, awkward Homo habilis settles under the stars. They have no idea of the legacy they carry, no knowledge of cities, languages, or podcasts, just life. And that, in itself, is extraordinary. The boar snuffles in the distance, the fireflies blink, and the ancient world turns, slowly, quietly, carrying forward the lessons of those who shuffled, grunted, and survived against all odds. In a way, the story continues in every human heartbeat, every careful thought, every quiet persistence. And with that, we drift off, into sleep, into dreams, into the long continuity of life itself. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the savannah 3.2 million years ago. The sun rises slowly over distant hills, painting the grasslands in gentle golds and soft browns. The air is cool, carrying the scent of dew and the earthy aroma of the ground. Somewhere nearby, a small group of Homo habilis begins to stir. They stretch their arms, long and slightly curved, as if reminding themselves that their limbs belong to both the ground and the trees. Fingers brush through grass, toes press into soft earth. A yawn escapes. It's quiet, peaceful, alive. Morning rituals. The first light of day is never wasted. The group moves slowly, testing the ground, checking for tracks of predators, of prey, of the ever-present boar. Some shuffle toward the nearest water source. Others remain near sleeping areas, warming in the early sun. Breakfast is a slow affair. There may be fruit fallen from trees, or roots dug carefully from soil, or a small carcass left behind by a lion. Every morsel is precious. A rock is chipped to reveal marrow. Fingers, rough and calloused, work deftly yet awkwardly. The focus is quiet, almost meditative. Communication is subtle, a grunt here, a gesture there, the raising of a brow. Each movement conveys meaning: danger, calm, curiosity, attention. Understanding flows without words. Midday movements. As the sun climbs, the group begins wandering. The savanna is wide, unpredictable, alive with sound. Insects hum, birds call, leaves rustle in the wind. Each step is careful but purposeful. Some habilis practice climbing small trees or scrambling over rocks, testing agility. Others sit and examine stones, holding them, turning them, feeling their potential. Every action is an experiment, a lesson, a rehearsal for survival. The boar may be out there. Its presence is sensed rather than always seen. A rustle, a snort in the distance, a shadow passing through grass, and suddenly attention sharpens. Movements become more deliberate. The group adjusts subtly, fluidly. Afternoon reflections. Time passes gently. The savanna is both friend and challenge. Habilis rests in shaded patches. Children crawl, stumble, and explore, watched over by adults whose gestures teach boundaries, caution, and care. Food is shared minimally. Social bonds are quiet but real. There is trust, tension, curiosity, and the beginnings of affection. Everything is measured, subtle, alive in a rhythm dictated by survival. Even small successes, like a cracked bone revealing marrow, or a fruitful patch of grass, or a predator avoided, bring quiet satisfaction. Not pride, not triumph, just relief. Continuation. Life. Evening calm. As the sun begins to set, the savanna softens in color. Shadows stretch long. The air cools. A gentle hush falls over the land. Habilis groups gather near familiar resting spots, moving carefully, curling together for warmth and safety. The boar may snort somewhere in the distance, but it is no longer a threat. Tonight, the world is calm. Communication softens. Grunts are fewer. Gestures become languid, almost soothing. The stars begin to appear, tiny pinpricks in a vast, endless sky. There's no understanding of constellations or stories yet, only the gentle awareness of vastness, of continuity, of being. Nightfall and sleep. Night deepens. The air grows cool and steady. Habilis rests fully now, pressed together, protected by numbers, lulled by the soft rhythm of the land. Every shadow, every sound, every memory of the day fades into the quiet. Tomorrow will come. There will be challenges, hunger, danger, the boar, and the relentless dance of life. But for now, there is calm. And in that calm, the story of persistence, curiosity, and awkward ingenuity flows quietly into the future. One small, scrappy, and remarkable species at rest beneath the stars.